Welcome to day 116 on the trail. We have four readings for today. From John chapter 4, verse 46 through 5:18, Numbers 24, verse 1 through 25:18, the 103rd Psalm, and 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 64. From Numbers 25, I wanted to comment briefly on what is known as religious syncretism and why it was a major source of trouble for ancient Israel. In Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3, we read, "While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Thus Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel." This story, in the first few verses of chapter 25, is blended with the marriage between an Israelite man and a woman of Midian. We see in this passage one of the most dangerous consequences for the people of Israel by intermarrying with the people of the surrounding regions. The people into whose land they were entering worshipped false gods, and many of which were based on fertility rites, such as the Canaanite god Baal. Therefore, when the people of Israel intermarried, they were also drawn into these fertility cults and the worship of other gods. This blending of religious beliefs and practices directly violated the first commandment. From Exodus 20, verses 2 and 3, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Through intermarriage, the people were drawn away from their worship of God alone and were lured into religious practices and traditions which were incompatible to God's plan and purpose for Israel. This included pagan religious practices and rituals that were condemned in the Torah, such as child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and sorcery. Now we see syncretism as a reoccurring problem throughout Israel's history, including the marriages of Solomon. For political purposes, Solomon had over 700 wives and 300 concubines in his harem. Now, while most of these numerous marriages were largely for diplomatic alliances and securing treaties with neighboring nations, the religious effects were devastating. According to 1 Kings chapter 11, Solomon's marriages led him into syncretism, encouraging worship of foreign gods like Ashereth, Chemosh, and Molech, violating the covenant with God. In our reading from 1 Maccabees today, we witness the terrible physical, economic, cultural, and religious suffering that Antiochus IV brings upon the Jewish people. Now, part of his cruel campaign was to defame God by destroying Torah scrolls and defiling the temple. One particularly abominable act was to erect a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering in 167 BC. This abomination of the desolation describes an idol being erected on the great altar in Jerusalem where unclean animals were sacrificed. We find references to this reprehensible act in the book of Daniel, in chapters 8, 9, 11, and 12. For example, in Daniel 12, verse 11, it reads, "From the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that desolates is set up." The general suggestion is that this abomination was an image of Zeus, for whom the temple is renamed by Antiochus. In the New Testament, Jesus adopts the same language to indicate that a similar desecration of the temple will occur in the future. Since the Second Temple will be destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, some scholars suggest that Matthew is connecting the action of the Romans with the desecrating acts of Antiochus IV. In Matthew 24, beginning in verse 15, we read, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, and was spoken of by the prophet Daniel," I'll let the reader understand, "then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and the one on the housetop must not go down to take what is in the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days." In many ways, the persecution of Antiochus and his affront against God was both a reflection on the destruction of the first temple at the hands of the Babylonians and to look forward to the destruction of the second temple by the Roman Empire. Finally, today, we turn to the Gospel of John. At the end of John chapter 4, Jesus returns to Cana of Galilee, the location of his first sign. As we discussed previously, the first sign of Jesus, performed at a wedding banquet, connected Jesus helping his mother in Cana with obeying the will of his Father in Gethsemane at the end of his earthly ministry. Also, we noted the dichotomy between external purity, as seen in Jesus' use of jars used for purification in Cana, and the inward purity symbolized in the cup of wine used during the Lord's Supper. Beginning in verse 46, we find Jesus' second sign, again performed in Cana. According to most scholars, this story found in John is actually paralleled in Matthew 8 and Luke 7. Now, in both Matthew and Luke, the royal official who pleads for help from Jesus in John's Gospel is a centurion in the Roman army. Also, while other details diverge slightly from John's account, one of the common elements is the serious nature of the illness and Jesus' ability to provide healing from a distance. Now, one question that we should ask here is, how is this miracle of healing a sign? Is there a deeper meaning that we should find in this story? While the sign itself is not explicitly stated, I think we may have some clues in how this story is presented. In verse 48, we have a strange statement by Jesus, immediately after the heartfelt request of the child's father. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." Now it seems that Jesus is directly addressing the Father here. However, the second person pronoun used here, you, is plural. So, is the crowd meant to overhear what Jesus is saying? Now I mentioned the crowd listening to Jesus because of what it says in verse 45. When he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, since they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the festival, for they too had gone to the festival. So, had they gathered around him that day only to see Jesus do miracles and signs? Did they welcome him to see something spectacular, or for who he claimed to be? One sent from God, and one who had the authority of God. To answer this question, let's take a step back in the larger story in John's Gospel. Earlier, in the case of Nicodemus, we are told that he saw the works of Jesus, which led him to the conclusion that Jesus was closely connected to God. However, it does not seem to be enough to lead Nicodemus to have faith in Jesus, or at least not during their conversation in John chapter 3. Then, when Jesus meets the woman at the well in Samaria, and Jesus tells her the truth of her entire life story, a story that she has been hiding, she immediately returns to town to let everyone know that she has just met the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Now, here in this story, the connection between the signs of Jesus and faith appears again. However, this time, the miracle does not occur in the immediate presence of those gathered around Jesus. Beginning in verse 49, the official said to him, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. As he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. Notice that the royal official believed the word that Jesus spoke without seeing the immediate result. Instead, he believes, pisteo. He had faith without seeing, and then returns home. Also, notice that a significant amount of time has passed between talking with Jesus and learning that his son was healed. When the official learns of his son's healing from his servant, they tell him that his son was healed yesterday, at the same time when he had pleaded with Jesus for the life of his son. In this second sign, we see the incredible faith of a Gentile. That is, without seeing, this royal official had faith in Jesus. This same point is communicated in the parallel story in Matthew 8, verse 10, where Jesus says of the centurion, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." Now finally, we see another dichotomy introduced by John: death and life. 3 times in this short passage, we are told that the child is ill and on the threshold of death. And 3 times, beginning in verse 50, we are told that through Jesus, the child will live. In the face of death's long shadow that has spread across this world from the beginning and throughout the generations, Jesus now brings life, true life. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.